Hey guys, this is Mikro. I'm doing a build guide on BBVG. This is mostly focused on like heavy like tank setup, maybe medium setup, not as much as the kill squad, but we'll talk about that a little bit. So I'm gonna go over the skill tree first, and then I put together what you should be looking for in like a full set, and then we'll go through that at the end. So tree-wise, there's a few ways to run this build. The Void Gauntlet tree is pretty much the same for every build. You don't go for the mana reduction stuff because you're using Refreshing Harvest so much that the mana reduction doesn't really matter. Um, and then you can weave that between your Blunderbuss shots, so you can go for your Blunderbuss autos and then swap to Void Gauntlet and then eat, and then do a single auto, which will be optimal for cooldown reduction, and go back to Blunderbuss, or you could swap to Void Gauntlet and use your abilities and go back to Blunderbuss, and your Blunderbuss will basically always be reloaded. I think that's generally how you play this, but there are times where you stick with the Blunderbuss, and it will probably feel better in general just to play with the Blunderbuss and be like less chaotic, but optimally you probably should be using both interchangeably. Blunderbuss, there's a few ways to build this, so there's like, these trees are very similar. This one would be like so I guess let's go over the attributes first, and then I'll go into trees because they all tie with the attributes. So like the standard setup that I think most people run for Blunderbuss in general, this should be 165, and then this should be, oh wait, I'm looking at this the wrong way. I did this earlier. Uh, so you got strength, int, and con. Generally, people run it like this, or you got 200 con, 165 strength, 150 int. It's a pretty safe build. It's what most people run. That would be like I'd consider it to be like a DPS support like hybrid. If you have 200 strength, 150 int, and 165 con, this would be a pure DPS oriented build, usually more present in like kill squads. More common with the Ice Gauntlet than a Void Gauntlet, I'd say, because a Void Gauntlet inherently makes you more squishy. And then there's a tank oriented build that I run the most, that a lot of EU people run. If you watch like EU VODs, you'll see a lot of people with 300 con. You see like almost 16k HP, and they're running this setup usually with 65 strength, 150 int, and 300 con. The reason why you'd run 300 con would be to get the CCs last longer perk, basically. The health matters a little bit, but not a ton. It's mostly for the CC lasting longer. For Void Gauntlet, it's good in particular because with Scream, it will make the Scream go from about 2 seconds to about 3 seconds every time you Scream, which makes it get more value. And then also if you run Purple Vines, it will also extend that duration, so it's possible to have like 9 seconds of root chain together if you have enough refreshing and you have 300 con. But usually people will just go for the rending vines anyway, because the rend is usually more important than the root on the vines, like the extra second at duration. The rend's a little bit better. So usually with this, if you're running that 150 int 200 con setup, which would be like the hybrid setup, then I would run a tree like this. This is a pretty standard right tree, left tree, deep loads, just consistent, like 15% extra damage every other shot, so it's hard to not like this, but this perk is flexible. Like, you could go fast hands if you wanted, you could go run and gun, whatever you want, really. And then this would be the DPS setup where you drop Fortify Aggression, so it's pretty similar. And then there's the tank-oriented setup. This is what I run for it. You could run Azoth Shrapnel if you wanted to and then cut Blast, but then you're like basically running this tree. I think Blast is better in the tank setup, and then the damage doesn't really matter because you just have, you're playing as a rend disease bot mostly, so the damage that you're doing doesn't matter as much. This perk is like flexible. It doesn't really matter what you go from this. Usually Barbed is okay because it gives you more ult charge, but it's like pretty insignificant. Ramp is pretty good, and then Future Endeavors is like consistent, like 12 stamina every couple seconds, so I think it's a little bit better, but I could see going Ramp as well. Run and Gun is just a good perk to have if you can get it right now, because it actually works on like last patch. So like going into detail with the equipment and what I consider to be best in slot for this. This is a little funny because this is a setup that I realized like a day ago, basically, maybe 2 days ago, that usually with tanks, it's probably more optimal to run 4 Rizzo rather than a 5, because the only perk that is run close to point that can has above a 3 crit mod is a Great Axe, and that's a 3/5. So you take like 5% extra damage if they land a crit, which isn't really that big of a deal. Like it's not like you're taking a ton of extra damage there. But because people don't really run Vicious anymore, people just run the thwarting because they assume that everyone will run 5 Zil, but I don't think you should run 5 Zil with this build. And then you can get more useful perks because you drop that, and as well as some of this last piece of gear will be cheaper in general. But on Blunderbuss, generally with this, you go Flame Attunement, Keenly Empowered. If you're off point, Enchanted's a little bit better than Keenly Empowered, but most builds Keenly Empowered is better. And then the third perk, Enchanted, if you're on point, would be best. Plague Splitting Grenade is close second. I could see this being interchangeable. A lot of people were like very hard on you need Plague Splitting Grenades. My argument for why you don't need it is disease is like very, very common. But if you're playing like a disease cap oriented build, like if you're playing a heavy version, then I would prio Plague Splitting Grenades over Enchanted, because that's like what you're building towards. And then if you're also playing a heavy version with the playing as a CC bot, then Plague Crits is probably better than Keenly Empowered, because you're not going to be doing a ton of damage anyways, and you're not really playing for that. Exhaustive Net Shot's also good. The Plague Crits I think is exclusive to the tank oriented build. Tainted Metal at that point is basically best in slot for this. It's not quite best in slot, but it's like close enough where you'd probably just run Tainted Metal if you're running the very, very low strength oriented build. On your Void Gauntlet, it's pretty standard. You want Scream, you want Keen. The reason why you want Keen, which I think for a traditional Void Gauntlet build, Keen is less important because you have so much built into other things, and you're going to hit the cap for CDR anyways, so I think Keen's a little bit overrated with most Void Gauntlet builds, but in this build, usually you don't run a Champion's Ring, so you don't have that Keen there, so you want the Keen on your Void Gauntlet. But if you are running Keen here, then you don't necessarily need the Keen on the Void Gauntlet, but Keen is still a solid perk to have, and you can't really go wrong with it. It's just it's maybe less value than one of these other perks. Usually you'd want Refreshing Move, which will increase your CDR significantly, and then you don't have to do the E auto tech, and you just get a lot more CDR off of that. Chain's also good because it'll build your ult faster. Chemo Jagged's also good because it'll build your ult faster. Last slot doesn't matter as much for Void Gauntlet. It's mostly about these two perks. BB last slot is very good and important, but also very expensive because you have to force Flame Attunement and then like Keenly Empowered one of these other perks, and then hope for a good last slot. In terms of like gear in general, this is like one of the only setups in heavy where I think Refreshing is better than Refreshing Ward, and the reason why I think that is because you're switching between weapons so much and you use both ability cooldowns so much that it makes sense to prio Refreshing since it affects both weapons, versus Refreshing Ward primarily affects your primary weapon. So it doesn't mean you're going to be switching between them so much. I think more Refreshing is better. I could also see like doing a half refreshing ward setup if you are actually taking aggro with this build, because people realize that you're running Void Gauntlet and Blunderbuss, or maybe a full refreshing ward setup if people are really paying attention to you. But if you're running the 300 con setup, then you'll always be able to live. If you're running 200 con, a little bit more risky, but I think you definitely go for the refreshing in that setup. And I think if you're a nuker, then you definitely go with refreshing. Just in the tank setup, this is a little bit more interchangeable, but I think refreshing is still a little bit more optimal. I think if you run 4 Rezo, as I discussed earlier, there's not really a case on point where people have above a 3/5 crit mod right now. There's no fire staff being run, there's very little dex being run that will actually hit the point. If you're off point, you probably want 5 Rezo, and then you want freedom and like 1 to 2 shirking fort, no matter what setup you're doing. I could also see elemental aversion if you're in a light setup as being better than shirking fort. So if you're in light playing as a nuker, I'd probably swap this with LA aversion. And this is just an example of like gear that you'd run. You have Scream on weapons, so you want Nullifying Oblivion. Diminishing Orb I don't think is a must-have anymore. It used to be a must-have, now I don't think it's as important, but it's still a good perk to have. So if you had a piece that dropped like a refreshing for Diminishing Orb, I would take it. It's just cleanse pots are less common, so it's not as good anymore. Because before it used to, there was a bug where it would affect cleanse pots. I'm pretty sure they changed that, or they said they did in the patch notes, so could be wrong because New World devs, but it's not as essential anymore. And then you want your exhaustive net or plague splitting grenades. Usually, if you're running one of those, if you're not like running one of those, you could replace this with the shirking forward and refreshing, like this hybrid slotted tier you could put into one or the other. And then you want your freedom and a lot of refreshing basically for all this. I don't think much of this is weird except for the 4 Resil, which I've talked about a few times at this point. 2 to 3 piece freedom is pretty common nowadays no matter what, just because of the Vine's ultimate. And shirking fort isn't as needed on Blunderbuss because you have so much passive uh, with this. So this is 15% passive. This is what 10% passive. So you're at 25% passive fort. You get below half HP, you get 50%. So you're pretty much always at fort cap anyway. If you have a good gem setup where you have like 25 slash ward, then you're just at fort cap off of that, not including runs. So the shirking fort isn't as necessary, but 1 to 2 is nice to have if you can get it. And I don't think having more shirking fort is really a bad thing because runs are more common, but I think the freedom will make you live more than shirking fort in general right now. On amulet, this isn't much of a surprise, but usually want to help slash protection, and then something with like stamina recovery, shirking and power, purify. I think champions is fine for amulet for most of these builds. For the heavy build, I wouldn't run it, but for light and then for medium, I think the champions is good because of shirking and power being the old version of shirking and power that procs much more frequently. So it just means that you'll have more DPS output, and you combine that with some of these other perks, and you'll really be like basically one-shotting clumps with this build if you build it right. Now we'll talk about the gem setup in a bit. I didn't put the armor gems on here, but I could talk about those as well. And then ring, it usually want invigorated punishment, hardy if you are in light or heavy, and then you want fire damage if you can get it. Like if you're in medium, you always want invigorated punishment, fire damage, and the third isn't as important. I didn't put leeching on here, but leeching is also a good perk to have with most of these setups because you will peel a lot off your AoEs. So yeah, that's good. Earring, refreshing toast, regen, refreshing I think is best. That's champion's earring. You could also run the one that you get from Blunderbuss, which I believe is Teardrop, which is pretty good. That's refreshing ward instead of refreshing. Just a preference there. Gems, I think no matter what, you want Ignited Malachite or a Malachite in these. If you're going for a fire damage boosting setup, I would probably go Ignited Malachite. There are like very niche cases where you go above 200 int, where having a tier 4 or a tier 2 gem would be optimal, I believe, but a tier 4 gem would be optimal for with the rune glass, it would be optimal for the ult generation, so it's probably worth it to run that instead over a tier 2, but tier 2 is a little bit better. That's mostly talking about P2R patch. On live patch, tier 2 is still more DPS than running a, a tier 5 rune glass, which is a little bit funny, but Ignited Malachite or Malachite here is good. If you're running 150 int, then you should be running the Ignited Malachite. I think Malachite is probably fine for some of these as well. I think Ignited Malachite's a little bit better because it's a little bit more damage with most things, but the Malachite is fine. It's not, you're not losing much by running it. And Malachite's now fixed, so you don't have to worry about bugs that made it make sense to run Opal everywhere. And then on armor, you want the gems that boost your fire damage. So all your damage with the blunderbuss is fire. You're mostly building for your blunderbuss damage, so you want to be stacking fire damage. So that will be like 10% extra fire damage from this. So you have the 5% extra fire damage from your ring. You have your weapon, which does fire damage, and then you'll be really pumping a lot more than you used to with this build when it was already meta before. So it's or blunderbuss already meta before. I think you run the Void Gauntlet Blunderbuss in spots where the Ice Gauntlet just isn't doing enough to get the kills that you need. Like maybe you just don't have enough VG Void Gauntlet like Ice Gauntlet players or something like that, or you're in a spot where you really hate the Ice Gauntlet because the tomb is super inconsistent now. I don't think it's as good as I originally thought it was, but I still think it's a very good build, and if you run it right, it is definitely a top end build that you could run on any server. And I think that's about it. Some of these like setups here, so with the attribute wise, uh, this is like a standard support DPS. 165, 150, 200. A nuker talked about this. Tank. This is what they run in EU. I think this is more experimental, like a pure support. I could see if you have enough refreshing, maybe you go 50 focus and you just all in on refreshing and you just spam abilities and be a pure disease bot and like really embrace the role that you don't want to do anything except spread debuffs. And then maybe run 50 focus for the 5% extra refreshing, and then you're just like constantly going back and forth between your blunderbuss and your void goblin applying debuffs. So maybe that is decent. And at that point, you would probably run like the tainted metal, maybe for plague crits set up with a plague splitting grenade on blunderbuss, and then you go in champions ring on the ring so that your plague crit supplies more. Plague crits is still somewhat broken on blunderbuss, but plague crits is somewhat inconsistent as well. As long as you target people that are below half HP, it's insane, because each one of those individual pellets can block the plague crits, which just makes it better than any other weapon to have it. It's just awkward because you usually don't run Keen with the blunderbuss. But if you're running it in a disease spreading setup, then it's good, and that's usually what this role is for. It's more of a disease passive like setup. Like I think this setup with the 50 strength typically and 300 con is generally the best way to run this build. It feels best to me. Uh, you would use generally stone form with this because you don't have a defensive. But if you were in a like I think if you're on defense in fort, I would use vines. If you're on point phase in fort, I would personally use stone form. If you're on attack in fort, I would use stone form, and if you're on point attack, then I would use vines, which sounds weird, but basically in spots where you can use vines, I would use it, and in spots where you need the extra HP to live, then I would use the stone form. I think there's also an option to use like the fortifying vines. I don't think it's bad. Otherwise, I think you could play with the ult a little bit more, but these are generally how you would run this. Shirking Fort with Blunderbuss is not as good as people used to think it was. Freedom is definitely better with the vines being in play. But yeah, this is how I run that build, and I have VODs of that on the channel, and you guys could check those out as well. And thanks.